Instead of marching in 4th of July parades or shaking hands and kissing babies at backyard barbecues, a group of Republican members of Congress spent their 4th of July behind Putin's curtain. While in Russia, they sounded what the Washington Post is today describing as a conciliatory tone in their meetings with government officials. Republican Senator Richard Shelby said that the U.S. and Russia, quote, don't need to be adversaries. He added, quote, I'm not here today to accuse Russia of this or that. Those comments, a verbal waving of the white flag on the question of Russian election interference. The Post reporting on the readout from Russian officials confirms this, with one Russian official describing the meeting as, quote, one of the easiest ones in my life. The Washington Post also reporting the Republicans meeting in Moscow coming after the lawmakers visited St. Petersburg and took in the ballet Sleeping Beauty helped set the tone for the July 16th Trump-Putin summit in Helsinki. Scary stuff. Director Brennan, this is setting the tone for the summit.
Well, it is very scary. First of all, it would have been much better if this was some type of bipartisan delegation.
Of course.
And also if there was going to be a little bit more insight that the U.S. press could have into this, as opposed to being done behind closed doors. But then that comment of the Russian official that this is one of the easiest ones in memory, have we forgotten what the Russians did in the 2016 election? Have we forgotten what the Russians did in Crimea? I'm all for an improvement in relations between Moscow and Washington, but it's on whose terms and how are we going to do that? And I just feel as though Mr. Trump is dealing away, whether it be to the North Koreans or the Russians, whatever, all of the things that are in U.S. national interest and giving them what they want. And this is, very concerning.
You know what it did, though? This is a broader picture of why they go along with and participate in the war on the Justice Department and the FBI. They clearly have had lobotomies, and they now share his view on this is no longer the Republican Party of John McCain or Joe Lieberman or people who were skeptical of Russia. This is now the party of Donald Trump when it comes to the question. And you're right, no one goes to a war zone or any other country that we view as a geopolitical adversary with just one party and with zero presence of press.
Well, they've attached themselves wholly to Donald Trump, and I think that they see the results of the 2018 election as being basically a decision on Trump. And so I think what they're trying to do is to pave the way and also lend their support, as well as lend their reputations and credibility to this. But I must tell you, the Russians will feign sincerity better than anyone I've ever dealt with in my life. And so they'll be very careful about being swept in. And I think Mr. Trump is not sophisticated enough, unfortunately, to deal with these foreign leaders in a manner that is going to protect U.S. national security interests. I think he's naive in these issues.
But that's Trump, and we've been having that conversation for months. But does it worry you that we're absent any guardrails in Congress?
Well, I don't see the guardrails right now. As you pointed out, unfortunately, John McCain is not there to help to tell his Republican colleagues that this is not the way that you conduct U.S. national security and foreign policy. Unfortunately, I think there are individuals who are just trying to think about what their political interests are as opposed to what the national security interests are.
And what do you think about the idea that these are the Republican members who may at some point have to contemplate a report from Bob Mueller about Russian interference in the 2016 election? Does it give you any pause that they're there with the Russians going to Sleeping Beauty, no press, no Democrats, saying things like, I'm not there to question them about this or that. This or that is meddling in our 2016 election and wanting to do it again in 2018. That's this and that's that.
Well, it doesn't give me confidence that they're going to deal with it in a very objective and in a very fair fashion. That they haven't demonstrated backbone yet, and I think by going out to Russia in this manner, I think it has not shown the American people that we are going to deal with Russia in a manner that protects our interests. But and on July 4th, moreover, it does not make sense. And
I know the former Flack in me died 1,000 deaths. I mean, just the optics of that. How big of a win is that? I mean, can we flip the script? I mean, does Putin go back and high five his schedulers for getting a bunch of Republicans from the Senate in Moscow on the 4th of July?
I think Putin must be very, very pleased with how this is going. Less than 2 weeks before the summit with Donald Trump, to have this delegation of Republican senators actually being wined and dined and saying nice things about Russia, and Russia officials saying this is a very easy meeting. Clearly, I think Putin feels that everything is smooth now. And then reports that, whether or not there's going to be a one-on-one meeting and who's going to be in the meeting with Trump and Putin is very, very important to make sure that that there's going to be no funny business, let me put it that way, that's going to be going on there.
And there's precedent for the president wanting to meet one-on-one with Vladimir Putin. He did so on the sidelines of NATO. There wasn't even an American translator there. He relied on Vladimir Putin's translator.
That's unheard of, absolutely unheard of. And again, I think it just shows his inexperience as well as the lack of controls on him. And, you know, presidents I worked for in the past, you know, the chiefs of staff and others would be right there and making sure that the president understood what are the equities at stake and what's the important thing to do. But it seems like Donald Trump is the one who's going to make these decisions, and I think, unfortunately, it's frequently at the expense of our national security.
So you coined the term witting or unwitting when you were under oath testifying before Congress about the role of, or the potential role of Trump campaign officials in Russian meddling or Russian shenanigans in the election. Did these members of Congress, these senators, become witting or unwitting agents of the Russian efforts to sort of snow what their role was in 2016? Did they give them some cover?
Well, I think they did. They didn't have to go to Moscow. It's one thing being in a situation and all of a sudden you find out that it's not what you expected. But they were the ones that went on their own to Moscow. They're the ones that actually sat down with Russian officials. They're the ones that are, I think, allowing themselves to be used and exploited, even just from a public relations standpoint right now. I don't know what was discussed behind the scenes. I'm hoping that some of those senators were tough. Maybe they were. But at least the perception is that they are giving in at this point to the Russians to just pave the way for the Trump-Putin summit.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.